She raised her glass and laughed. My husband never even finished college. I stayed silent. The next morning, I sent one document. If this line already grabbed your attention, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and leave a comment with your thoughts. I read every single one. My name is Daniel, and I never imagined I'd live to see the day when the woman I loved would use me as the punchline to her success. The night of her graduation party was supposed to be her celebration, and I came ready to clap, smile, and stand behind her as I always did. The restaurant was filled with her classmates, professors, and a handful of family and friends. I stayed near the bar, nursing a drink, watching as she basked in the glow of their admiration. My wife, Amanda, was always ambitious. She had a way of commanding attention, of standing taller than everyone else in the room, even if she wasn't the tallest. I loved that about her once. But that night, I saw another side of her, one that would change everything. At some point, one of her friends raised a toast, praising Amanda for her perseverance, for working so hard to get through college while balancing marriage. Amanda laughed, lifted her glass, and with a smile that could cut through steel, said, "Well, at least I finished. My husband never even got a degree." The group erupted in laughter, all eyes darting toward me like arrows. I froze, my face burning. It wasn't just the joke, it was the way she said it, with pride, like humiliating me was part of her achievement. I placed my glass on the counter and slipped out of the room, not saying a word. Nobody followed. Nobody cared. I walked down the street that night, the air heavy with the sound of her laughter still echoing in my head. I thought about the sacrifices I had made to keep her afloat. I was the one who worked long hours, the one who picked up overtime, the one who quietly carried the weight of tuition payments, textbooks, rent, and bills, so she could study without worry. I never complained. I never reminded her of what it cost me. I believed in her dream more than she did. And yet, in front of everyone, she reduced me to a joke. When I returned home, the house was dark. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the papers in my briefcase, documents she never bothered to ask about. I had all the control, and she never even realized it. Every tuition check, every sponsorship form, every signature bore my name. It was me who carried the legal weight, not her. She thought finishing college gave her the upper hand, but in reality, her success was standing on my shoulders. That realization lit a fire in me I hadn't felt in years. I didn't confront her that night. I didn't scream or demand an apology. Instead, I went to bed, my back turned to her when she finally stumbled in, smelling of wine and victory. She fell asleep instantly, while I lay awake, staring into the darkness, my mind racing. For years, I had been the silent supporter, the one in the background, and now she had mocked me for it. The silence became unbearable, but I kept it, because sometimes silence is the sharpest weapon you can wield. The next morning, I woke early, showered, dressed, and sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop. The morning sun lit the room as I typed, my fingers steady, my decision unshakable. I filled out the form I had thought about the night before, the one she never dreamed I would touch. It took me less than 20 minutes. With a single electronic signature, I ended the sponsorship that had carried her through. I attached it to an email addressed to Amanda, hit send, and closed the laptop. No message, no explanation, just the document. Then I turned off my phone, placed it in a drawer, and walked out the door for work, leaving the quiet house behind me. I didn't check my phone all day. I didn't need to. Somewhere across town, Amanda would open her inbox and realize what I had done. She would know in an instant that the foundation beneath her feet had been pulled away, and it was my hand that did it. For the first time in years, I felt a weight lift from my chest. I had taken back my dignity without raising my voice, without lowering myself to her level. All it took was one document. When I came home, that evening the silence in the house felt heavier than usual. Normally Amanda would already be in the kitchen reheating leftovers or on the couch scrolling through her phone, but that night the air was thick with tension. My phone, still shut off in the drawer, was a ticking bomb waiting to explode with whatever messages she had already sent. I didn't rush to turn it on. I hung up my jacket, poured myself a glass of water, and sat down at the table, listening for the sound of her footsteps. Minutes later, the front door slammed and she stormed in, her eyes red, hair disheveled, clutching her purse like it was a weapon. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I lifted the glass to my lips and drank slowly, letting her words hang in the air. She dropped the purse onto the chair and pulled out her phone, shoving it toward me with the email open. You can't just cancel it. You can't. Do you have any idea what this means for me? I looked at her, calm, almost detached, and said nothing. The silence drove her mad. She slammed the phone down and paced the room, muttering about ruined plans, the embarrassment, how she would look to her classmates now that the funding she bragged about was gone. I had heard it all before, though not in these words. For years, every problem was mine to solve, every obstacle mine to clear, and she had grown used to it. She never once stopped to think what it cost me, only what it gained her. That night her mask cracked. For the first time I saw fear in her eyes, not ambition, not pride, just raw fear that the ground she stood on was no longer steady. I let her pace, let her spill every word like venom. And when she finally stopped in front of me, waiting for some reaction, I spoke only one sentence. Now you'll learn to stand on your own 2 feet. The way her face shifted, from rage to disbelief to despair, was something I'll never forget. She whispered, "You wouldn't do this to me." I looked her dead in the eyes and replied, "I already did." She crumpled into the chair across from me, her hands shaking. I could hear her breathing unevenly, see her trying to form words that never came out. I stood up, rinsed my glass, and placed it in the sink. Without another word, I went upstairs, leaving her with her thoughts. It wasn't triumph I felt, not exactly. It was something deeper, something heavier, like reclaiming a part of myself that had been buried under years of sacrifice and humiliation. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while she sat downstairs, the glow of her phone flashing every few minutes as she desperately tried to call someone who could fix what I had undone. She didn't come up to the bedroom, and I didn't go down to check on her. The distance between us was a canyon, and for the first time I was content to let it stay that way. I thought back to all the nights I had worked overtime, all the birthdays and weekends I had missed to keep her dream alive, and I wondered how I had ever convinced myself that this was love. The following morning, she tried a different approach. She came into the bedroom, her voice soft, her face pale. She sat on the edge of the bed and whispered my name, as though we were back to being newlyweds. She spoke about how much the degree meant to her, how she couldn't throw away years of work over a misunderstanding. She even reached for my hand, but I pulled it away. Her words no longer reached me. I had seen the real Amanda the night of her graduation party, and no amount of sweet talk could erase that. I told her I wasn't interested in excuses, that she had shown me exactly who she was when she chose to mock me in front of everyone. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't flinch. For years I had given her my strength, and now I was keeping it for myself. She left the room without slamming the door this time, her steps slow, heavy. I heard her on the phone later, begging someone to help her figure out what to do next. I didn't know who she was talking to, and I didn't care. The sponsorship had been mine to give, and it was mine to take away. It was as simple as that. That day at work, while I fixed yet another set of client files, I felt lighter than I had in years. My colleagues noticed the change, asked if something good had happened, and I just smiled faintly. They would never know the storm raging at home, but I knew. I was finally free of the weight that had been pressing me down for far too long. When I returned home, that evening the house was quiet again, but this time the silence didn't suffocate me. It soothed me. I cooked myself dinner, ate it alone, and enjoyed the peace of not being interrupted by complaints or demands. Amanda stayed in the other room, probably still plotting her next move, but it didn't matter anymore. She could rage, she could beg, she could cry. I had already chosen my path. One document had changed everything, and there was no going back. The days that followed turned into a strange routine I had never expected. Amanda barely spoke to me, and when she did, her words came out clipped and sharp, like broken glass. She floated between rage and desperation, sometimes slamming cabinets in the kitchen, sometimes sitting at the dining room table with her head buried in her hands. I watched from a distance, almost like an outsider, detached from the storm she had created. At work I was calmer, lighter, almost cheerful compared to the weight I carried before. But at home I could see her unraveling, thread by thread, as she realized the support she had always leaned on was gone. On the third day after I sent the document, she finally cornered me. I had just walked through the front door, still holding my briefcase, when she blocked the hallway with arms crossed, eyes swollen from crying. "Daniel, please, "We need to talk," she said, her voice shaking. I didn't stop walking. "We've already talked," I replied. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging in just enough to sting. "You don't understand. I can't finish this without you. I'll lose everything I've worked for." I turned slowly, looked her in the eyes, and said, "Then maybe you'll learn how it feels to lose what you've taken for granted." Her grip loosened, and she stepped back, tears rolling silently down her face. Later that night, I found her sitting in the living room surrounded by papers, her laptop open with endless tabs flashing across the screen. She was searching for alternatives, grants, loans, anything that could save her from the hole she now found herself in. The sight of her desperation might have moved me once. I might have sat beside her, reassured her, promised that everything would be okay. But not anymore. I simply walked past and went upstairs, leaving her drowning in the reality she had brought upon herself. I started sleeping better. For the first time in years, my nights were uninterrupted, my body finally letting go of the tension that had built up from years of carrying her weight. Amanda, however, barely slept. I could hear her pacing at night, opening drawers, shuffling papers, whispering frantic phone calls. I knew she was begging her parents for help, maybe even reaching out to professors for sympathy, but no one could erase the fact that the foundation of her education had been built on my support. Without it, the tower crumbled. By the weekend, she tried a new tactic. She dressed up, cooked dinner, lit candles, and poured me a glass of wine as though nothing had ever happened. She smiled nervously, her eyes darting to me, waiting for some sign of softening. "Remember when we used to do this?" she asked, her voice almost gentle. I nodded but said nothing. I ate the meal, drank the wine, and listened to her try to paint a picture of the life we once had. But every word sounded hollow, every memory poisoned by the laughter of that night at her graduation party. She tried to touch my hand across the table, and I let it rest there for only a second before pulling away. The look on her face said everything. Hope slipping away, replaced by panic. That night she didn't cry. Instead, she exploded. She screamed about how ungrateful I was, how she had worked harder than anyone to achieve her degree, how I was jealous of her success. Her voice echoed through the house, sharp and relentless, but I stood silently in the doorway until she had nothing left to say. When the room finally fell quiet, I answered her with a calmness that enraged her even more. "Jealousy has nothing to do with this. Respect does. And you lost mine the moment you mocked me in front of everyone." She threw the wine glass at the wall, shards scattering across the floor, and stormed upstairs, slamming the bedroom door. I stayed downstairs, swept up the pieces, and sat in the silence she left behind. The next morning, she didn't come out of the bedroom. I went about my routine, coffee, breakfast, work, without pausing to check on her. I no longer felt the urge to chase after her moods, to rescue her from herself. When I returned that evening, she was sitting on the couch, staring at the television that wasn't even turned on. Her eyes were empty, her body slouched, as though the fight had drained out of her completely. She turned to me slowly and whispered, "I don't know who I am without this degree." For a brief moment, I saw the vulnerability she had hidden for years, but it didn't erase what she had done. I set my keys on the counter and replied, "Maybe it's time you figure that out." Then I walked upstairs, leaving her in the dim light of the living room, surrounded by silence that was louder than any scream. Each day that passed only solidified the truth. Amanda had built her identity on the foundation I provided, and when I pulled it away, she didn't know how to stand. Watching her stumble was not easy, but it was necessary. For too long, I had been the invisible backbone of her dream, and she had mistaken my sacrifices for weakness. Now she was discovering the cost of her arrogance. And I, for the first time in years, was discovering the strength of my silence. The following weeks turned into a cold war inside our home, a war fought not with raised voices or slammed doors, but with silence that cut sharper than any knife. Amanda tried everything. She tried charm, cooking, carefully chosen words meant to sound apologetic, but her eyes always betrayed the panic burning underneath. She tried anger too, hurling accusations at me in sudden outbursts before dissolving into tears, and I would simply watch, unmoved, like someone observing a storm through a window. I had made my choice the morning I pressed send, and nothing she could do would reverse it. Each day she sank deeper into the reality she never thought she would face, that without my sponsorship, Her so-called independence was nothing but an illusion. I noticed small changes around the house that revealed just how desperate she was becoming. The fridge grew emptier because she stopped buying the expensive groceries she loved to flaunt. Piles of letters from the university and the bank gathered on the table, unopened, as if ignoring them could make them disappear. She no longer strutted out of the house dressed in designer clothes for classes or parties. Instead, she stayed inside most days, hiding in sweatshirts and staring at her laptop with a face that looked more defeated each time I walked past. She had mocked me in front of her friends for not having a degree, but now she couldn't even finish hers without the man she ridiculed. One night, I found her sitting on the edge of the bed, clutching her phone with trembling hands. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Daniel, please, I'll do anything. Just don't take this from me." She looked smaller somehow, fragile, like a child begging not to be punished. I stood there in the doorway, the memory of her laughter at that graduation party flashing in my mind, and I felt nothing but clarity. I answered her the same way I had the first time. "Now you'll learn to stand on your own 2 feet." She broke down completely then, sobbing into her hands, and I walked out of the room. I didn't slam the door. I didn't need to. The sound of her crying was proof enough that the message had finally landed. Work became my refuge. While Amanda withered under the weight of her own choices, I found myself rising. My coworkers noticed the change in me, the steadiness in my voice, the way I carried myself with quiet authority. They didn't know the details, but they could sense that I had reclaimed something important. For years I had been in the shadows, sacrificing without recognition, but now the balance had shifted. I was no longer a man defined by what I gave away, but by what I chose to keep for myself. Amanda's friends stopped coming around. The same people who once laughed at her joke now avoided the house altogether. Perhaps they sensed the tension, or perhaps she was too ashamed to face them. Either way, the gatherings and the noise were gone. The house that once rang with her ambition and her pride now sat quiet, and in that quiet I found peace. I spent evenings reading, cooking simple meals, or taking long walks alone, rediscovering who I was without her constant demands. She, meanwhile, drifted like a ghost through the rooms, hollow-eyed and restless. The glow of triumph from that graduation night extinguished entirely. Eventually, the calls from the university grew more frequent, the letters more urgent. She left them scattered on the table, envelopes torn open with words like "outstanding balance" and "suspension of enrollment" stamped in bold. I said nothing. It wasn't my battle to fight anymore. One evening, she finally confronted me, holding a letter in her hand, her voice trembling. "They're going to end it. Everything I worked for will be gone." I met her gaze and replied calmly, "You worked for it, but I paid for it. Don't forget that." She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She just stared at me, realizing maybe for the first time the depth of her dependency. Weeks turned into months, and the proud woman who once mocked me in public had been stripped of her pedestal. She learned, piece by piece, what it meant to be without a safety net. She begged, bargained, lashed out, but none of it mattered anymore. The sponsorship was gone, and with it, her power over me. She would have to find her own way forward, and whether she rose or fell was no longer my concern. I had done my part. I had carried her far enough. And through it all, I discovered a truth I should have seen long before. Dignity cannot be bought, and respect cannot be begged for. It must be given freely, and once it is taken away, nothing can bring it back. The night she mocked me in front of everyone was the night she lost that respect forever, and by sending one document, I reminded her that I was never the fool she thought I was. If you've stayed with me through this story, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and leave a comment below. Tell me what you think. Was I right to do what I did, or should I have handled it differently? I read every single one of your thoughts, and your voice matters here.